A tiny black girl stands trembling in court, whispering, "Please, Your Honor, please don't send me back." Across from her, a powerful businessman smirks, his lawyer dismissing her as a troubled child. But when a court officer demands her immediate return, her desperate cries shake the room. Judge Daniels sees the fear in her eyes. Boom. His gavel slams down. "No one is leaving until I get the truth." The courtroom locks down. What is this man hiding? Why is the system protecting him? And how far will one judge go to uncover the truth? Stay tuned. This story will leave you speechless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the otherwise austere room. Judge Everett Daniels strode into Courtroom 7, his black robe billowing slightly with each purposeful step. The weight of his responsibilities seemed to rest heavily on his broad shoulders as he approached the bench. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Everett Daniels presiding. Bailiff Johnson's voice rang out clear and strong, his words echoing off the high ceiling. The shuffle of feet and rustling of papers filled the air as everyone stood. A few whispered conversations died away instantly. Judge Daniels settled into his high-backed chair, his weathered face revealing nothing as he surveyed the room with eyes that had seen thousands of cases, both tragic and triumphant. "Be seated," he commanded, his deep voice carrying authority without harshness. For the next hour, Judge Daniels handled routine cases with efficiency, traffic violations, minor disputes, and small claims. His responses were measured, his judgments swift and fair. But there was something in his demeanor, a slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was waiting for something more important. "Next case," the court clerk announced, shuffling through her papers with practiced movements. "State versus Walter Harrington, foster care custody hearing for Michaela Robinson." The double doors opened with a subtle creak, and Walter Harrington entered the courtroom like he owned it. His custom-tailored suit, charcoal gray and impeccably pressed, probably cost more than most people made in a month. He adjusted his gold cufflinks with practiced ease, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he surveyed his domain. His lawyer, Alan Winthrop, stood ready at the defense table, arranging his expensive leather briefcase with precise movements that spoke of years of high-stakes courtroom battles. At the prosecution table, David Fisher wiped his sweaty palms on his department store suit pants, the fabric already showing signs of wear at the knees. His fingers trembled as he sorted through his paperwork, dropping several sheets that scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. A few snickers echoed from the gallery as he scrambled to collect them, his face flushing red with embarrassment. The heavy wooden doors creaked open once more, the sound somehow more ominous this time. The room fell silent as Bailiff Johnson led in a tiny figure. Michaela Robinson looked even smaller than her 8 years, swimming in a faded blue dress that hung loose on her thin frame, its hem slightly frayed at the edges. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to hold herself together against an invisible wind. Her large brown eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal's, taking in the towering ceiling, the rows of wooden benches filled with strangers, and finally, the imposing bench where Judge Daniels sat watching her carefully. The contrast was stark, Walter Harrington standing tall and confident, his very presence commanding attention, while Michaela seemed to shrink into herself with each step, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Whispers rippled through the gallery like a disturbed pond, and Judge Daniels' eyes narrowed slightly as he observed the scene before him, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Michaela's worn sneakers, their once white laces now gray with age, barely made a sound as Bailiff Johnson guided her toward the witness stand. She looked up at the tall wooden chair with apprehension, her small fingers twisting the hem of her dress into tiny knots. The bailiff helped her up, his usually stern face softening as he steadied her, and she perched on the edge of the seat like a bird ready to take flight at the slightest movement. Her hands found the wooden railing, gripping it so tightly her knuckles showed white against her dark skin. When she caught Walter Harrington's cold stare from across the room, she quickly looked down at her lap, her shoulders hunching forward protectively. making herself an even smaller target. Judge Daniels leaned forward slightly, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly as he watched the child before him. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he moved, highlighting the wisdom earned through years of service. The courtroom fell completely silent, the tension almost palpable as everyone waited for what would happen next, the only sound the gentle whir of the ceiling fans overhead. "Miss Robinson," Judge Daniels said, his voice gentler than it had been all morning, taking on the tone he usually reserved for his own grandchildren. He paused, waiting until Michaela gathered the courage to look up at him, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting away again. "Are you ready to tell me why you're here?" Michaela's small fingers gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand, her knuckles stark white against her dark skin. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as she lifted her chin, gathering every ounce of courage in her tiny frame. Her worn sneakers barely touched the floor from where she sat, and the oversized sweater she wore made her look even smaller than her 8 years. When she spoke, her voice trembled but carried clearly through the hushed room. "Please, Your Honor, please don't send me back." A gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by shocked murmurs. Several people leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between Michaela and Walter Harrington. An elderly woman in the back row pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Walter remained perfectly composed, adjusting his silk tie with manicured fingers. A small, almost patronizing smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he shook his head slightly, as if watching a mildly amusing play. His lawyer, Alan Winthrop, leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms across his chest. His expression suggested this was all merely a tedious delay in what he considered an already decided matter. Judge Daniels studied Michaela intently, noting how she seemed to curl into herself, making her already small frame appear even tinier. Her shoulders hunched forward protectively, and her eyes kept darting to the floor, then back up, as if afraid to hold anyone's gaze for too long. He leaned forward, his lined face serious but gentle. "Miss Robinson," he said in a measured tone, careful to keep his voice steady and non-threatening, "why are you afraid to return?" Michaela swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. Her hands gripped the railing tighter, as if drawing strength from the solid wood beneath her fingers. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she brushed it away quickly with her shoulder. "Because..." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Because he hurts me." The silence that followed was deafening. It pressed against the walls of the courtroom, heavy and unbearable. Several members of the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared openly at Walter Harrington. In the second row, Loretta Robinson pressed her clasped hands to her chest, her eyes never leaving her granddaughter. Walter cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. He shook his head slowly, his expression that of a disappointed parent dealing with a troublesome child. His perfectly controlled response seemed calculated to draw sympathy, but Judge Daniels's eyes narrowed slightly as he observed the performance. The judge's fingers drummed once, twice on his bench, the only outward sign of his growing concern. David Fisher, who had been frantically shuffling through his papers, his hands trembling slightly with nervous energy, finally found his voice. He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. His tie was slightly crooked, and his suit wasn't nearly as expensive as Winthrop's, but his voice rang with conviction. "Your Honor," he said, his words coming out stronger than anyone might have expected. "We request a full review of Michaela's foster care records before any decision is made." Walter's lawyer didn't even bother to stand as he scoffed. "This is unnecessary. The child has behavioral issues." His dismissive tone seemed to fill the room with ice. Judge Daniels raised his hand, the simple gesture immediately silencing the room. His expression had hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his authority. The afternoon sun streaming through the high windows cast deep shadows across his face, making him look carved from stone. "We will see," he stated firmly, leaving no room for argument. Turning his sharp gaze to the bailiff, Judge Daniels' next words rang with purpose. "Get me her foster care records. Now." Bailiff Johnson nodded crisply and strode from the room, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Michaela released a shaky breath, her small hands still clutching the railing as if it were a lifeline. A slight tremor ran through her shoulders, but her chin remained lifted, showing a glimpse of the strength that lay beneath her fear. Walter Harrington's soft chuckle echoed through the courtroom, the sound making Michaela's shoulders tense. He leaned toward his lawyer, his perfectly pressed charcoal suit rustling as he whispered something behind a well-manicured hand. Alan Winthrop's face split into a confident grin as he rose from his chair, straightening his navy silk tie with practiced precision. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a child's overactive imagination," Winthrop declared, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured dismissively toward Michaela, who seemed to shrink even further into herself, her small hands trembling in her lap. "Michaela has a history of lying. Look at her file. She's been difficult with social workers before. She's created problems in every foster home she's been placed in." The words hung in the air like poison. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the imposing figure of Walter Harrington and the tiny girl on the witness stand. A woman in the front row clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles white with tension. Judge Daniel's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes never left Michaela. He noticed how she flinched when Walter spoke, how her small body seemed to curl inward as if trying to make herself invisible. Her reaction spoke volumes more than any words could. The judge's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he watched her struggle to maintain her composure. "I want those records here now," Judge Daniels commanded, his voice sharp as he addressed the bailiffs. The urgency in his tone made several court officers snap to attention, their boots squeaking against the polished floor as they moved to comply. Walter remained perfectly at ease in his chair, one leg crossed casually over the other. His smirk grew wider as he watched the proceedings, like someone enjoying a particularly entertaining show. His confidence seemed to fill the room, suffocating in its intensity. He adjusted his gold cufflinks with deliberate slowness, drawing attention to his obvious wealth and power. Michaela's fingers tightened around the wooden railing of the witness stand until her knuckles turned white. Her eyes remained fixed on her lap, refusing to look in Walter's direction. The faded blue dress she wore seemed to swallow her whole, making her appear even more vulnerable. A loose thread at her sleeve caught her attention, and she picked at it nervously. David Fisher, seated at the prosecution table, shuffled his papers nervously. His tie was slightly crooked, and a thin sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead. He opened his mouth several times to object, but seemed unable to find the right words in the face of Winthrop's polished performance. His legal pad was covered in hastily scribbled notes that now seemed woefully inadequate. Judge Daniels leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he observed the scene before him. The contrast between Walter's relaxed demeanor and Michaela's obvious distress did not escape his notice. His fingers drummed thoughtfully on the bench for a moment before he reached for his gavel, the movement deliberate and measured. The sound of wood striking wood rang out as he tapped it once on the bench, the sharp crack cutting through the tension like a knife. "Then let's see what the records actually say," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. The weight of authority in his voice made even Walter's smile falter slightly. The double doors of the courtroom burst open as a court clerk rushed in, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished floor. In her arms, she clutched a thick manila folder that looked worn at the edges, its corners softened from years of handling. She handed it to Bailiff Johnson, who strode purposefully to Judge Daniel's bench, his uniform crisp in the fluorescent lighting. The judge accepted the folder with a nod, his weathered hands carefully opening it. The familiar, musty smell of old paper filled the air as he began to examine the contents, the pages crackling softly as he turned them. Within seconds, deep lines appeared between his brows, etching worry into his normally composed features. Something was wrong, very wrong. Page after page revealed a disturbing pattern. Where there should have been complete reports, he found gaps. Entire sections were blacked out, while others seemed to have been completely removed. His fingers traced over the edge of what appeared to be torn pages, the rough edges telling their own story of deliberate removal. Some pages showed signs of having been carefully sanitized, with white correction fluid covering what must have been crucial information. He paused at a particular entry, his expression darkening. Michaela's previous social worker was listed simply as no longer with the department. No explanation, no transfer details, just gone. The date stamp on the entry showed it was just 3 months ago, far too recent for such vague documentation. Further in the file, 2 separate child abuse complaints caught his attention, or rather, what was left of them. The crucial details were missing, the pages containing the actual allegations nowhere to be found. Judge Daniels's jaw clenched as he noticed the dates. Both complaints had been filed within months of each other, and both had been mysteriously closed without investigation. Then came the most troubling discovery. Buried in the middle of the file was a brief mention of another foster child who had been placed with Walter Harrington. The report stated matter-of-factly that the child had ran away, but as Judge Daniels flipped through the subsequent pages, searching for any follow-up investigation or resolution, he found nothing. It was as if the child had simply vanished into thin air, becoming just another statistic in the system's cold database. Taking a deep breath, Judge Daniels placed the file down on his bench with deliberate care, the sound echoing in the silent courtroom. His hands came together, fingers interlacing as he lifted his gaze to study Walter Harrington. The businessman sat there, still projecting an air of casual confidence, but something had shifted in the room. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "Something's wrong with this case," Judge Daniels stated, his voice cutting through the hushed courtroom like a knife, each word weighted with growing suspicion. The tension in the room became palpable. The gallery seemed to hold its collective breath, the air thick with anticipation. David Fisher, Michaela's young lawyer, straightened in his chair, hope and anxiety warring on his face, while Alan Winthrop's smug expression flickered briefly, a crack appearing in his polished facade. In her seat at the witness stand, Michaela kept her head down, her small hand still gripping the wooden railing. She didn't look up, didn't dare to hope, but her knuckles had gone white from her tight grip, her shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly. And there, for the first time since the hearing began, Walter Harrington's confident smirk began to fade, replaced by something harder, colder. His eyes narrowed slightly, calculating, as he watched the judge examine the evidence of his carefully constructed world beginning to unravel. The tension in courtroom 7A had become almost unbearable. Judge Daniels continued to flip through Michaela's file, his expression darkening with each turn of the page. The sound of paper rustling seemed deafening in the hushed room. Sweat beaded on foreheads as the minutes stretched like hours, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, drawing all eyes to a man in an impeccably tailored black suit. His shoes clicked against the floor as he walked with calculated steps toward Bailiff Johnson. The stranger's face remained expressionless as he leaned in, whispering something that made the bailiff's shoulders stiffen. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees with his presence. Bailiff Johnson cleared his throat, his usual confident demeanor wavering. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar. "Your Honor?" He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "There's been an administrative error in Michaela Robinson's placement records." The words fell like stones in still water. "She must be returned to her foster home immediately." The color drained from Michaela's face. Her small fingers gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, like a trapped bird. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away with her sleeve. Walter Harrington settled back in his expensive leather chair, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face. He adjusted his gold cufflinks with deliberate slowness, exchanging knowing looks with his lawyer. The fluorescent lights caught the diamond pin in his silk tie, making it sparkle with cold brilliance. David Fisher scrambled through his messy stack of papers, his hands shaking. Coffee-stained documents slipped from his grasp, scattering across the floor. "Your Honor, that makes no sense." His voice cracked with desperation. "The placement documentation we received clearly shows—" The courtroom erupted into chaos. Whispers turned to loud discussions, heads shaking in disbelief. Several people in the gallery stood up, pointing and gesturing. A woman in the back row began to sob quietly. The man in the black suit remained motionless, his face a mask of indifference as he watched the scene unfold, his presence like a dark shadow over the proceedings. Through it all, Walter's smirk grew wider, more confident. He leaned forward to whisper something to his lawyer, who nodded with smug satisfaction. Their quiet exchange carried an air of victory that seemed to poison the very air around them. Michaela's small frame began to shake. Tears welled up in her large brown eyes as panic overtook her. Her pink barrette slipped loose from her braided hair. "Please," she cried out, her voice breaking through the noise. "Please don't let them take me." The raw fear in her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Judge Daniels's face hardened as he raised his gavel high. Bang! The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, reverberating off the wood-paneled walls. "Enough!" His voice thundered across the room, silencing everyone instantly. His steel-gray eyes swept across the courtroom, challenging anyone to speak. The veins in his neck stood out as he leaned forward on his bench. "No one is leaving this courtroom until I get to the truth." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Walter's smirk faltered slightly as Judge Daniels' penetrating gaze settled on him. Michaela's ragged breathing was the only sound that could be heard in the stillness that followed, punctuated by the slow tick of the ancient wall clock. The sound of Judge Daniels rising from his chair sent a ripple through courtroom 7A. His black robe seemed to billow as he stood to his full height, commanding attention with his imposing presence. His dark eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, every reaction, lingering briefly on the trembling form of young Michaela. "Lock the doors," he ordered, his voice cutting through the air like a blade of ice. The words hung heavy in the suddenly still courtroom. Bailiff Johnson's hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before his training kicked in. He moved with purpose toward the heavy wooden doors, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The metallic sound of locks engaging echoed through the chamber, making several people jump in their seats, the finality of it sending a chill through the room. Gasps erupted from the gallery, followed by worried whispers that rippled through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. "He can't do that," someone muttered from the back row, their voice trembling with uncertainty. Others shifted nervously in their seats, the wooden benches creaking under their weight. Walter Harrington's trademark smirk flickered, a crack appearing in his carefully maintained facade. His expensive suit suddenly seemed to fit a little tighter as he shifted in his chair, one hand absently adjusting his silk tie. Beads of sweat began to form on his upper lip despite the room's cool temperature. Alan Winthrop, Walter's high-powered attorney, leaped to his feet, his Italian leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. His face flushed red with indignation, the color creeping up his neck and into his cheeks. "Your Honor, this is absurd. You can't—" Bang! Judge Daniels' gavel crashed down, the sound like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. "I just did." The words carried the weight of steel, brooking no argument. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a person moved, not a paper rustled. Even the usual creaking of the old courthouse seemed to hold its breath, as if the building itself understood the gravity of the moment. David Fisher sat at his table, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time since the hearing began. Though beads of sweat still dotted his forehead, relief flickered across his young face. He'd never witnessed anything like this in his brief legal career, but something told him he was watching justice unfold in real time. In the witness stand, Michaela's chest heaved with rapid breaths, her small frame shaking with each intake of air. Her wide brown eyes darted around the room like a sparrow searching for escape, from the locked doors to Walter's face, then back to Judge Daniels. Her small fingers gripped the wooden railing so tightly, her knuckles showed white against her dark skin, the wood creaking softly under her desperate grip. Walter Harrington's composure continued to crack. His manicured fingers drummed a steady rhythm on the defense table, tap, 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 betraying his growing unease. The sound seemed to echo in the tense silence, each tap like a countdown to something inevitable. Judge Daniels turned his attention to the man in the black suit, who stood perfectly still near the bailiff's station. The judge's eyes narrowed dangerously, decades of courtroom experience telling him exactly what this man's presence meant. "Who sent you?" The man remained silent, his face an expressionless mask, but something in his stance suggested he hadn't expected this turn of events. His right hand twitched almost imperceptibly toward his jacket pocket before going still. Drawing a slow, deliberate breath, Judge Daniels picked up Michaela's case file. He tapped it against his desk, the soft thud emphasizing his words, the sound carrying the weight of years of injustices he'd witnessed. "If you think I'm letting this child leave this courtroom without answers." He paused, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, each word carefully measured and heavy with intent. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The silence in courtroom 7A was deafening. Judge Daniels leaned forward, his weathered hands forming a steeple beneath his chin. His eyes, usually stern but fair, now held something darker, a quiet fury that made even the most seasoned lawyers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the high windows, making the tension in the room feel almost physical. "Bailiff," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried through the entire room, making the hair on people's necks stand up. "Bring me every document related to this case, every single one right now." Bailiff Johnson nodded sharply and hurried from the room, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. The sound of the door opening and closing seemed unnaturally loud, like a gunshot in a library. Alan Winthrop paced near his table, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor, each step betraying his growing anxiety. "This is outrageous," he muttered, pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. "The state bar will hear about this. You can't just lock people in a courtroom." Walter Harrington sat perfectly still except for his left hand, which kept checking his watch with increasing frequency. His eyes darted to the window, then back to the door, then to his watch again, a pattern of mounting unease. The confident smirk had vanished entirely now, replaced by something that looked almost like impatience, maybe even fear. In the gallery, people squirmed in their seats, the wooden benches creaking under their nervous movements. A woman in the back row fanned herself with a piece of paper, her face flushed with the heat of the packed room. Two lawyers from another case whispered urgently to each other, their heads bent close together, casting furtive glances at the judge. Michaela remained frozen on the witness stand, her small hands gripping the wooden railing so tight her knuckles were white against her dark skin. Her eyes bounced between Judge Daniels and the locked doors like a trapped animal searching for escape or protection. Her chest rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. The man in the black suit stood perfectly still near the bailiff's station, like a statue in an expensive suit. He adjusted his tie with precise movements but maintained his silence, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Walter leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something through clenched teeth that made Winthrop's face turn an even deeper shade of red. Before he could protest further, the door opened again with a heavy creak. A court clerk hurried in, her arms laden with additional files, papers threatening to spill from their folders. She placed them carefully on Judge Daniels' bench, stepping back quickly as if afraid to be too close to the brewing storm, her shoes making soft scuffing sounds on the worn carpet. The judge opened the topmost file, the paper crackling in the hushed room. The room held its breath as his eyes scanned the pages, the only sound the soft whisper of turning papers. With each passing second, his jaw tightened more and more until a muscle visibly twitched in his cheek, a physical manifestation of his growing anger. The sound of him slamming the file shut made everyone jump, the sharp crack echoing off the wooden walls. "This case," he announced, his voice heavy with revelation and barely contained rage, "is bigger than I thought." The courtroom air felt thick and heavy, like a storm about to break. Judge Daniels sat back in his high-backed chair, his presence filling the room with an authority that made even the seasoned lawyers squirm. His arms folded across his chest as he fixed Walter Harrington with a piercing stare, his weathered fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm against his black robes. "Tell me, Mr. Harrington," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made several people in the gallery catch their breath and lean forward in their seats. "Why is half of this girl's file missing?" Michaela shifted in her seat, her small frame tense with fear. Her breathing came in short, shaky bursts, and her worn dress seemed to swallow her whole. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, making her look even younger and more vulnerable than her 8 years. Her feet, in scuffed shoes that were a size too big, barely touched the floor. Walter sat perfectly still, his expensive suit without a single wrinkle, his posture relaxed as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. A gold watch glinted on his wrist as he adjusted his silk tie. Before he could speak, his lawyer, Alan Winthrop, jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, I fail to see why we are still here." Winthrop's voice carried that particular tone of entitled outrage that only expensive lawyers seem to master, his face flushing red with indignation. Judge Daniels cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "I didn't ask you. I asked him." The words fell like hammer blows in the silent courtroom, making the young court reporter's fingers pause over her keyboard. Walter tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a slow, condescending smile that never reached his cold eyes. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Maybe some things just get lost in bureaucracy. His voice was smooth as silk, but there was something underneath it. Something that made Michaela pull her arms tighter around herself and sink deeper into her chair. Judge Daniels exhaled sharply. He'd heard that tone before, in this very courtroom, from men who thought their money made them untouchable, who believed the law was just a game they could win with the right moves and the right payments. His fingers gripped the edge of his bench, knuckles whitening. Michaela remained quiet, her small hands curled into tight fists on her lap, her knuckles white with tension. She stared at the floor, as if trying to make herself invisible, her dark braids falling forward to shield her face. The heavy doors opened again as Bailiff Johnson returned, carrying another stack of papers. The sound of his footsteps seemed to echo in the tense silence, each step punctuating the stillness like a countdown. He placed the documents carefully on the judge's bench, the papers rustling softly in the quiet room. Judge Daniels began flipping through them, his experienced eyes scanning each page with careful attention. The soft whisper of turning pages was the only sound in the courtroom. His fingers suddenly paused over one document and his expression hardened. There, in the middle of a crucial report, was a black mark, a name completely redacted, as if someone had been systematically erased from the record. The judge lifted his head slowly, deliberately. His eyes, sharp with decades of experience seeing through lies and deception, met Walter's confident gaze. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim as he leaned forward, his shadow falling across his bench. The question came out low and precise, each word carefully measured. "Who did you pay off?" For the first time since entering the courtroom, Walter's smirk disappeared completely, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Judge Daniels' weathered fingers gripped the redacted file, his knuckles whitening with barely contained anger. The thick manila folder seemed to mock him with its deliberately missing pages and blacked-out sections, each redaction a deliberate attempt to hide the truth. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the locked courtroom, casting harsh shadows across worried faces and making the tension feel almost electric. "This is not a clerical error," he announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "Someone erased these records on purpose, and I intend to find out why." David Fisher, his confidence growing slightly with each passing moment, leaned forward in his chair. His tie was slightly crooked, and his suit was wrinkled from hours of sitting, but his voice had steadied. "Your Honor, if there are missing files, then Michaela's placement was never properly reviewed. The entire process could be compromised." From across the room, Alan Winthrop let out a dismissive laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "This is ridiculous. You're holding us here over misplaced paperwork?" His expensive suit rustled as he stood, spreading his hands in an exaggerated gesture of disbelief. A gold watch glinted on his wrist, catching the harsh light. Judge Daniels fixed him with a glare that could have frozen water. "Paperwork doesn't misplace itself, Mr. Winthrop, and patterns like this don't happen by accident." Walter Harrington sat perfectly still at the defense table, only his fingers moving, tap, tap, tap against the polished wood. It was the kind of nervous tick common to powerful men who weren't used to being questioned, who believed themselves above the law. Bailiff Johnson's shoes squeaked against the floor as he returned, carrying another stack of files that seemed to weigh heavily in his arms. The judge began sorting through them, his expression darkening as he pulled out 2 old CPS reports. One bore a stark red stamp, closed due to insufficient evidence. The paper was yellowed with age, but the stamp remained bright, like a warning sign. The room watched in heavy silence as Judge Daniels methodically reviewed each page, the sound of turning paper unnaturally loud in the quiet courtroom. His eyes narrowed when he came across the records of 2 former foster children who had been in Walter's care. Both were simply marked as runaway. No follow-up investigations, no final reports. Just 2 children who had vanished into thin air, their stories buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Daniels looked up slowly, his face carved from stone, years of judicial experience telling him something was terribly wrong. 2 missing children, no follow-ups, and now a 3rd child terrified for her life. His voice dropped to something dangerous and icy, each word carefully measured. "Mr. Harrington, what exactly happened to those other children?" The change in Walter was subtle but unmistakable. The smirk that had seemed permanently etched on his face finally slipped away, replaced by something harder and colder. His confident facade cracked just enough to reveal the darkness lurking beneath. The sound of Walter Harrington's chuckle sent a chill through the courtroom, making several spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. He settled back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced consequences in his privileged life. His tailored suit, probably worth more than most people's monthly salary, didn't show a single wrinkle as he smiled, teeth gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You think I had something to do with that?" His voice dripped with amusement, smooth as honey but cold as ice, each word carefully chosen to project innocence. The gallery collectively leaned forward, the wooden benches creaking under their shifted weight. Several people whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes darting between Walter and the judge. The air grew thick with anticipation, making it hard to breathe. Michaela's small fingers curled into tight fists, her nails digging crescents into her palms. Her shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to make herself even smaller, her eyes fixed on the floor tiles. David Fisher fumbled through his messy stack of papers, his hands trembling slightly. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he searched for something, anything that might help. His tie felt too tight, and he resisted the urge to loosen it. Alan Winthrop shot to his feet, his expensive suit rustling. The golden cufflinks on his sleeves caught the light as he gestured dramatically. "Your Honor, this is absurd. There is no proof my client is involved in any crime." His voice carried the practiced indignation of a lawyer who was used to getting his way. Judge Daniels lifted the stack of heavily redacted files, his weathered fingers tracing the blacked-out lines. "No proof. Because it was conveniently erased?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and precise. The heavy doors creaked open as Bailiff Johnson strode in, clutching a weathered manila folder. "Your Honor, we found something in old city records." His footsteps echoed as he approached the bench, each step seeming to increase the tension in the room. Judge Daniels took the file, his eyes scanning the contents. With each line he read, his expression hardened like concrete setting. The document revealed a massive sum of money, transferred to a former CPS worker who had mysteriously vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty apartment and countless questions. Walter's fingers, which had been drumming steadily against the table, suddenly went still. The silence in their absence was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. "Someone was paid to keep quiet," Judge Daniels announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Walter's shoulders rose in an elegant shrug, his face a mask of practiced innocence. A hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Money moves hands all the time, Judge. That doesn't mean I touched it." The words were casual, almost playful, but there was steel beneath them, a warning wrapped in silk. Judge Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the bench. The fluorescent lights cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the determination in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous like thunder before a storm. "Then I suggest you start praying, Mr. Harrington, because I'm about to find out exactly where that money went. A soft knock interrupted the tense silence of the courtroom. Judge Daniels looked up as his assistant approached, sliding a small folded note onto his bench with trembling fingers. The paper crinkled as he opened it, his weathered hands smoothing out the creases, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed room. His eyes moved across the words, just a few lines, but they made his breath catch. A name. A warning. Check on former social worker Angela Perry. She tried to speak up. She's gone. The words seemed to burn themselves into his mind, each one carrying a weight that settled heavy in his stomach. The judge's fingers tightened around the paper, crinkling it slightly. The implications were clear. This wasn't just about one frightened little girl anymore. This was about a pattern, a deliberate effort to silence those who dared to question. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture darker than he'd imagined. David Fisher noticed the change in the judge's demeanor, saw the subtle shift from concern to something harder, more determined. The young lawyer shifted in his chair, his tie suddenly feeling too tight against his throat, his collar damp with nervous sweat. "Your Honor?" He ventured cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's wrong?" Judge Daniels carefully tucked the note under the thick manila folder on his desk, his movements deliberate and measured. When he spoke, his voice remained steady, controlled, but there was steel beneath the words. "We keep going." He turned to Bailiff Johnson, who stood at attention near the door, his uniform crisp and straight. "Pull every CPS record under Angela Perry's name. Every case she handled, every report she filed. Everything." The words rang with authority, leaving no room for question or delay. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted like a gathering storm. Alan Winthrop's usual smugness cracked, revealing a flash of tension beneath his polished exterior. His fingers drummed against the defense table, a nervous rhythm he couldn't seem to control, the soft tapping echoing in the silence. Walter Harrington, however, maintained his composure. Almost. There was something different now, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible clench of his jaw. It wasn't fear. Men like him didn't show fear. It was annoyance, the kind that comes when carefully laid plans begin to unravel, when control starts slipping through perfectly manicured fingers. In her seat, Michaela watched it all with wide eyes, her small hands clutching the edges of her chair. She might not have understood the complex web of adult dealings happening around her, but she recognized the shift in Walter's demeanor. She had seen that look before when things didn't go his way at home. It was the calm before the storm, and it made her shrink further into her chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. Judge Daniels leaned forward, his gaze fixed directly on Walter Harrington. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face as he spoke, each word precise and measured. "Mr. Harrington, tell me, do you know Angela Perry?" Walter's lips parted slightly, but for the first time since entering the courtroom, no smooth words came out. The silence stretched, heavy and telling, as the man who always had an answer found himself without one. The quiet seemed to grow louder with each passing second, filling the room with unspoken accusations. Bailiff Johnson strode forward, his footsteps echoing in the hushed courtroom, as he placed a thick manila folder on Judge Daniels' bench. The folder's edges were worn, speaking of countless hands that had touched it over the years. The judge's fingers traced the edge of the file before opening it, his expression growing grimmer with each page he turned. The yellowed papers inside told a story, one that made his stomach turn. Coffee stains marked the corners, and paper clips had left rusty indentations on several pages. Angela Perry's final report lay at the top, dated exactly 3 years ago. The words jumped off the page. Suspected abuse, bruising, withdrawal symptoms, child refuses to speak. Below them were photographs, their colors faded, but their message clear. The subject of the report, Jordan Matthews, age 9, a small boy with bright eyes and a missing front tooth. 2 weeks after the report was filed, Jordan vanished. Just another runaway, according to the official record. Judge Daniels' hands tightened around the edges of the paper until they trembled slightly. From her place at the witness stand, Michaela's small voice broke through the silence. "Jordan, He was at the house before me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to disappear, her purple sweater bunching up around her shoulders. David Fisher pushed his glasses up his nose, finding a surge of courage. His tie felt too tight, but his voice didn't waver. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stronger than before. "This makes 3 children who have disappeared while in Mr. Harrington's care. 3 children who showed signs of abuse before vanishing." Walter Harrington sat perfectly still, but his facade was beginning to crack. A muscle twitched in his jaw, his fingers drumming faster against the table. His expensive watch caught the fluorescent light with each movement. Alan Winthrop jumped to his feet, his expensive suit rustling. The silk handkerchief in his pocket fluttered like a nervous bird. "This is pure speculation, Your Honor. You can't possibly suggest—" The gavel crashed down, the sound like a thunderclap. "I can and I will, Mr. Winthrop." Judge Daniels's voice cut through the air like steel. "1 missing child is a tragedy. 2 is concerning. 3 is a pattern." He shuffled the papers, laying them out in front of him with methodical precision. "A pattern I refuse to ignore any longer." Walter's composed mask finally slipped. His usual smugness disappeared, replaced by something harder, colder. His eyes darted to the locked courtroom doors, then back to the judge, calculating distances and possibilities. Judge Daniels surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on each face before him. The weight of 3 lost children pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He drew in a deep breath, his decision crystallizing in the heavy afternoon air. "We're going to find Jordan Matthews," he announced, his words falling into dead silence. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each second of the tension. The gallery held its breath. Michaela's fingers gripped the witness stand tighter, her knuckles pale against the dark wood. Walter's knuckles turned white against the dark wood of his chair, his wedding ring glinting dully. And somewhere in a file no one had touched for 3 years, Jordan Matthews's face smiled up from a forgotten photograph, waiting to be found, his missing tooth a small black space in an eternal moment of joy. Judge Daniels sat at his bench, his knuckles white as he gripped Jordan Matthews's missing case file. The afternoon light filtering through the high courtroom windows cast long shadows across the room, matching the dark mood that had settled over everyone present. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, seemingly oblivious to the tension below. David Fisher dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, his young face showing the strain of the morning's revelations. His tie hung slightly askew, a small detail that spoke volumes about his mental state. Walter Harrington maintained his relaxed posture, but the subtle clench of his jaw betrayed his growing unease. His usual rhythmic finger tapping had ceased entirely, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the light as he shifted almost imperceptibly in his chair. "I want an immediate forensic check on Harrington's financials," Judge Daniels announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. His words seemed to drop into the room like heavy stones into still water. Alan Winthrop shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. The leather chair behind him scraped loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, this is entirely unnecessary." "Sit down, Mr. Winthrop." Judge Daniels's words carried such authority that Winthrop practically fell back into his chair. A wave of whispers swept through the gallery as people leaned forward, sensing the gravity of the moment. The sound was like leaves rustling in an autumn wind. Bailiff Johnson gave a curt nod and stepped out, his footsteps echoing in the hushed courtroom as he went to arrange the emergency financial audit. The door closed behind him with a soft but final click. David Fisher cleared his throat, finding courage in the judge's decisive action. "Your Honor, this could establish a pattern of bribery and cover-ups." His voice grew stronger with each word, though his hands still trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers. A pencil rolled off his desk, the small sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Walter adjusted his silk tie, a small gesture that seemed more like a nervous tic than his usual confident movements. His silence spoke volumes. Gone was the smug businessman who had walked in hours ago. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his upper lip. Michaela sat small and quiet, her eyes fixed on her hands folded in her lap. The weight of the morning's revelations pressed down on her narrow shoulders like a physical burden. Her small fingers twisted the hem of her dress, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past few hours. The heavy doors creaked open as Bailiff Johnson returned. His face was grim, his usual professional demeanor tinged with concern. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his features as he stepped forward. "We have a problem," he announced, stepping closer to the bench. Judge Daniels raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. The wood of his chair groaned softly under the shift in weight. "What kind of problem?" Bailiff Johnson lowered his voice, but in the silent courtroom, his words carried clearly. "There's a flagged account, large withdrawals, right before each child vanished." His words hung in the air like smoke. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Someone in the back row let out a strangled, "Oh my God!" The sound of shock rippled through the room like a wave, leaving stunned silence in its wake. Papers rustled, chairs creaked, and the afternoon light seemed to dim, as if nature itself was responding to the weight of this revelation. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across Walter Harrington's face as his carefully maintained facade began to crack. His expensive suit, usually worn like armor, now seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders, the Italian wool dampening with sweat at his collar. Judge Daniels's fingers drummed deliberately on his bench, each tap echoing through the silent courtroom like a countdown to judgment. "Mr. Harrington, care to explain why your account shows large cash withdrawals before the disappearance of each child under your care?" The judge's words cut through the air like a blade, sharp enough to make several spectators flinch. Alan Winthrop shot to his feet, his designer tie slightly askew, a bead of sweat trailing down his temple. "Your Honor, my client's personal finances are not up for discussion in a child custody hearing." "This isn't just a custody hearing anymore," Judge Daniels fired back, his voice carrying the weight of years on the bench and countless cases of injustice. The gallery erupted in whispers, a wave of tension rippling through the room like an electric current. David Fisher straightened in his chair, his earlier nervousness giving way to determination. His hands stopped shaking as he organized his notes, sensing the tide turning in their favor at last. Beside him, Michaela sat perfectly still, her small frame rigid with attention, her purple dress wrinkled from hours of sitting. She turned her head slightly, daring to look at Harrington. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The powerful man who had terrorized her now looked worried, truly worried, his usual mask of confidence crumbling at the edges. Bailiff Johnson approached the bench with a stack of financial records, his footsteps heavy against the wooden floor, each step punctuating the tension. "The first withdrawal, Your Honor. $50,000 2 days before Jordan Matthews was reported missing." He flipped to another page, the paper crackling in the hushed room. Another large sum withdrawn the week Tommy Stevens disappeared. The gallery's whispers grew louder, a rising tide of murmurs and gasps, forcing Bailiff Johnson to call for order with a stern voice that echoed off the high ceiling. Walter's fingers curled around the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white as bone. The polished wood creaked under his grip, a sound like breaking resolve. Judge Daniels leaned forward, his presence filling the courtroom from wall to wall. His eyes, sharp and unrelenting, bore into Walter Harrington with the intensity of a searchlight cutting through darkness. The afternoon light caught the judge's face, highlighting the deep lines of determination etched there, carved by years of pursuing justice. "Mr. Harrington," Daniels spoke, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous, each word deliberate and weighted with authority. "Where is Jordan Matthews?" The silence that followed was deafening, thick enough to choke on. Walter Harrington's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. For the first time since the hearing began, he spoke without his lawyer's prompt, his carefully constructed world beginning to unravel thread by thread. The afternoon light filtering through the high courtroom windows had grown dim, casting long shadows across Walter Harrington's face. He drew in a measured breath, his chest rising and falling with practiced control, his manicured fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the polished table before him. His lawyer, Alan Winthrop, leaned in close, his whispers urgent and sharp, but Walter's expression remained carved from stone, a mask of calculated indifference. Judge Daniels sat like a statue behind his bench, arms crossed, his dark eyes never leaving Walter's face. Years of experience had taught him to read the subtle tells of guilt, and everything about Harrington's controlled demeanor set off warning bells. The tension in the room was suffocating, pressing down on everyone present like a physical weight. Michaela's small frame seemed to shrink even further in her chair, her fingers twisting the fabric of her worn dress until the seams threatened to come loose. Suddenly, Alan Winthrop's composure shattered. He slammed his palms against the wooden table, the sharp crack making several people jump. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he shouted, "This is a clear case of judicial overreach." His voice cracked with barely contained panic, his expensive suit doing nothing to mask his growing desperation. Judge Daniels didn't even blink, his steady gaze unwavering. "You're panicking, Mr. Winthrop." His calm observation cut through the air like a knife, making the lawyer's outburst seem all the more desperate. The words hung in the air heavy with meaning. Walter finally broke his silence, leaning forward with the same smooth confidence he'd shown all morning, his silk tie gleaming in the fading light. "I don't know where that boy is." The words fell from his lips with chilling finality, each syllable precise and measured. Michaela visibly shuddered, her small body trembling at the coldness in his tone, her dark eyes wide with recognition of the lie. The heavy courtroom doors burst open as the prosecution team rushed in, papers clutched in their hands, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. They approached the bench quickly, presenting a fresh report with trembling fingers. Judge Daniels' eyes scanned the pages, his expression growing darker with each line, his jaw clenching tight. More names emerged from the shadows. 2 former caseworkers who had vanished without a trace, their disappearances perfectly timed with key developments in past cases. Financial records revealed a web of payments, systematic bribes to keep social workers quiet, all carefully disguised, but now laid bare. Judge Daniels lifted the damning file and tossed it onto his desk with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of justice. "This is criminal." His voice carried the weight of years of justice denied, decades of children failed by the very system meant to protect them. The courtroom fell into dead silence, the kind that comes before a storm, when even the air seems to hold its breath. Judge Daniels turned to Bailiff Johnson, his next words dropping like thunder. "I want Mr. Harrington taken into custody now." Gasps erupted throughout the gallery, a wave of whispers spreading like wildfire. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Bailiff Johnson moved toward Walter Harrington, his handcuffs glinting in the dying light. The man who had seemed untouchable all these years was finally facing justice, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The heavy silence of the courtroom shattered as Bailiff Johnson and his fellow officers moved purposefully toward Walter Harrington. Their footsteps echoed against the polished floor, each step bringing them closer to the man who had thought himself untouchable. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Michaela's small fingers curled tighter around the wooden railing of the witness stand, her knuckles turning white from the pressure. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. She watched Walter's shoulders bunch up under his expensive suit jacket, his usual calm demeanor cracking like thin ice. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, betraying his rising panic. "Mr. Harrington," Bailiff Johnson said firmly, his hand resting on his belt. "Please stand." For a moment, Walter remained seated, his face a mask of stone. Then, without warning, he exploded into motion. He lunged forward, knocking over his chair with a loud crash that sent people scrambling backward. The heavy wooden chair clattered across the floor as screams erupted from the gallery, and chaos broke loose. Several spectators pressed themselves against the walls, trying to distance themselves from the unfolding scene. Michaela jerked back in her seat, a small cry escaping her lips. Her whole body trembled as memories of his anger flooded back, the sound of breaking glass, the thunder of his footsteps on the stairs. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to make herself as small as possible, just like she used to do in that dark closet. "Get him!" Bailiff Johnson shouted, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. Two officers grabbed Walter's arms, their quick reaction stopping him before he could get far. He thrashed against their hold like a wild animal, his carefully maintained facade completely shattered. His silk tie had come loose, his perfectly styled hair falling across his forehead as he struggled. Spittle flew from his mouth as he snarled at the officers. "You can't do this!" Alan Winthrop jumped up from his seat at the defense table, his face red with anger and panic. "This is completely illegal. We'll have your badge for this, Your Honor. We'll—" "Order!" Judge Daniels's voice boomed over the chaos, his gavel cracking against the wooden block with authority. "Order in the court!" The sharp rap of the gavel echoed through the chamber like gunshots. The bailiffs wrestled Walter's arms behind his back, their movements practiced and efficient. The metallic click of handcuffs cut through the noise, followed by Walter's grunt of pain as they secured his wrists. The cold steel seemed to finally break through his rage, replacing it with something closer to disbelief. Michaela opened her eyes slowly, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her chest felt tight, but something else was building inside her, something that felt almost like hope. She watched as Walter, the man who had terrorized her, who had made her feel so small and helpless, was himself being restrained. His expensive suit was rumpled now, his commanding presence diminished by the officers holding him firmly on each side. The perfect image he'd worked so hard to maintain was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Judge Daniels stood at his bench, his presence commanding attention even amid the chaos. His eyes found Michaela's, and in that moment, she saw something in his gaze that she hadn't seen in a long time from any adult, a promise of safety, of protection. His expression was firm but gentle, silently assuring her that everything would be okay. "Get him out of here," Judge Daniels ordered, his voice steady and firm, cutting through the remaining murmurs in the courtroom. The bailiffs began moving Walter toward the door, their grip unyielding. His expensive leather shoes scraped against the floor as they led him away, the handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights. The man who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable just hours ago, was being marched out like any other criminal. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight draining from him with each step. Just before they reached the door, Walter twisted his head back, his eyes finding Michaela one last time. The hatred in his gaze was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, fear. But this time she didn't shrink away. She sat up straighter in the witness stand, her chin lifting slightly as she watched them lead him out, knowing that for the first time since entering his home, she was truly safe. A small spark of strength flickered to life inside her chest, growing stronger with each step that took him further away. The chaos in the courtroom swirled like a storm. Walter Harrington thrashed against the bailiff's grip, his perfectly pressed suit now wrinkled, his carefully controlled facade crumbling with each passing second. His face had turned an angry shade of red, veins bulging at his temples as he fought against the strong hands holding him back. Judge Daniels rose from his bench, his black robes flowing with the movement, authority radiating from his tall frame. "Get him out of here!" His commanding voice cut through the noise like thunder, making several people in the gallery flinch. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the room, followed by Walter's grunt of protest. Michaela sat frozen in her seat, her small hands gripping the edges until her knuckles turned white, her wide eyes fixed on the scene before her. She had never seen Walter lose control like this. He had always been so careful, so measured in his cruelty, hiding his true nature behind a mask of respectability. Alan Winthrop, Walter's lawyer, jumped to his feet, his expensive tie askew and his face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," he shouted, waving his arms wildly, briefcase forgotten at his feet. "You have no grounds to hold my client." Judge Daniels fixed him with a glare that could have frozen fire, his jaw set firmly. "I have every ground," he said, his voice deadly calm, each word precise and measured. "Your client is being taken into custody for child endangerment, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Reporters' pens scratched frantically against notepads, their eyes bright with the scent of a breaking story. The sound of camera shutters clicking filled the air like angry insects. Walter's voice boomed through the courtroom as the bailiffs dragged him toward the door, his expensive shoes scuffing against the polished floor. "This isn't over, Daniels," he roared, spittle flying from his mouth, his composed businessman persona completely shattered. "You think you can take me down?" Michaela watched him go, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her legs felt weak, even though she was sitting down, and her hands trembled slightly in her lap. David Fisher, her young lawyer, let out a heavy breath beside her, his shoulders sagging with relief, his tie loose around his neck. Judge Daniels rubbed his temple, the weight of the day's revelations visible in the tired lines of his face and the slight slump of his shoulders. Then he looked at Michaela, his eyes softening with genuine concern. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle but firm, carrying the warmth of a father's reassurance. Michaela felt something unfamiliar wash over her. Relief, yes, but mixed with fear of the unknown, like stepping onto new ground after a long time in darkness. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, shaky but clear. "What happens to me now?" Judge Daniels met her eyes, holding her gaze steadily, his expression full of compassion and determination. "We'll figure that out," he assured her, his tone carrying the weight of a promise, one that seemed more solid than any she'd heard before. The words hung in the air, a bridge between the nightmare of her past and the uncertainty of her future. For the first time in a long while, Michaela allowed herself to breathe, her small shoulders relaxing just a fraction under the weight of newfound hope. The emptiness of the courtroom felt different now, less threatening but still heavy with uncertainty. Michaela's small feet swung back and forth, not quite reaching the floor from the wooden bench where she sat. Her faded dress was wrinkled from the long day, and her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. A half-eaten sandwich from lunch lay forgotten beside her, evidence of her nervous appetite. David Fisher paced near the gallery, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, emergency placement? No, she can't go back into the regular system. I understand the protocols, but this is different." His voice carried a newfound confidence, though his hands still trembled slightly. Sweat dampened his collar as he fought for Michaela's future, one phone call at a time. Judge Daniels emerged from his chambers, his stern face showing signs of wear. Deep lines creased his forehead, and his shoulders sagged beneath his black robes. The weight of the day's revelations had taken their toll, but there was still work to be done. His fingers absently traced the worn edge of his desk as he surveyed the room. Bailiff Johnson's footsteps echoed as he entered, his usual rigid posture slightly relaxed. "Harrington is in holding, Your Honor," he reported, keeping his voice low but clear. "The DA's office is already reviewing the case. They're talking about multiple charges." His hand rested on his belt, near his badge, a habit born from years of service. Judge Daniels nodded, then turned his attention to Michaela. His voice softened as he spoke. "You have no living parents, child. We need to be very careful about where you go next." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A clock ticked somewhere in the background, marking each precious moment. Michaela's small hands gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles whitening. The thought of another foster home made her stomach twist into knots. She'd seen enough of those to last a lifetime. Her braids, neat this morning, had started to come loose, much like her grip on hope. The sharp knock on the courtroom door made everyone turn. Rosa McKinney strode in, her sensible shoes clicking against the floor. The social worker's arms were full of paperwork, but her eyes were kind as they fell on Michaela. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, swaying with each determined step. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "we can't put her back into the system. Not after what we've uncovered. She needs real family. Someone who will actually protect her." Her voice carried the weight of 20 years of experience and too many similar cases. Judge Daniels sighed deeply, nodding in agreement. "The question is, does she have any?" His fingers drummed quietly on the bench, a rare show of uncertainty. "There might be." David Fisher spoke up, lowering his phone. Hope flickered in his eyes for the first time that day. His tie, loosened hours ago, hung crookedly around his neck. The judge moved across the room, his robes rustling softly. He knelt down in front of Michaela, bringing himself to her eye level. The action made him seem less intimidating, more human. "Michaela," he said gently, "do you remember anyone? Any family at all?" Michaela's fingers twisted in her lap as she thought. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but it carried a trace of hope. "My grandma." A tiny spark lit up her eyes as the memory surfaced, like a star breaking through storm clouds. The judge's chambers felt warmer than the courtroom, with its wood-paneled walls and soft lamplight casting a gentle glow across the room. A collection of law books lined the shelves, their leather spines worn with years of use. Judge Daniels sat behind his desk, his black robe draped over the back of his chair, while David Fisher occupied one of the leather chairs, papers spread across his lap and spilling onto the floor beside him. Rosa McKinney stood by the window, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones as late afternoon sunlight streamed in behind her. Michaela perched on the edge of a chair that seemed too big for her small frame, her feet barely touching the ground. Her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of chamomile tea that Bailiff Johnson had brought her, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. The sweet floral aroma wafted up, but she hadn't taken a sip yet, holding it like a shield, giving her something to focus on besides the churning in her stomach. "Nothing in the original placement records," David muttered, shuffling through documents with growing frustration. His tie had come loose, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "It's like they deliberately buried any mention of family. Every time I think I've found something, it leads to another dead end." Judge Daniels rubbed his temples, the weight of the day evident in the slump of his shoulders and the deep lines around his mouth. "Of course they did. Harrington made sure of that. He's thorough. I'll give him that much." Rosa's voice suddenly lifted with excitement, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Yes, I understand. Just one moment." She lowered the phone, her face breaking into a smile that lit up her entire expression. "I found her." Michaela's head snapped up, her fingers tightening around the warm cup until her knuckles went white. Her heart began to race, thundering against her ribs. "Her name is Loretta Robinson," Rosa continued, her voice gentle as she watched Michaela's reaction. "She's been searching for her granddaughter for years. She never stopped looking, not for a single day." Judge Daniels' stern expression softened, but his brow furrowed with concern. "Then why couldn't she find her? A grandmother has rights." David Fisher flipped through another stack of papers, his movements quick and agitated, sending several sheets floating to the floor. "Because Harrington had the legal guardianship sealed. Look at this." He held up a document, jabbing his finger at a particular paragraph. He blocked all outside claims. No one could access the records, not even immediate family. He built a legal wall around her. Rosa turned back to her phone, dialing quickly with practiced fingers. The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of numbers being pressed. Then, a connection crackled through. "Mrs. Robinson?" Rosa's voice was professional but kind, tinged with barely contained joy. "This is Rosa McKinney from Child Protective Services." Through the phone speaker, they could hear a woman's hesitant voice, weathered by years of worry. "Yes? Mrs. Robinson, I'm calling about your granddaughter, Michaela." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press against their ears. Then came a choked sob that made Michaela's hands shake around her teacup, causing ripples in the amber liquid. "Michaela? She's alive? My baby's alive?" Michaela's breath caught in her throat, and tears welled in her eyes. The voice, even through the phone, carried warmth she hadn't felt in years, like a forgotten memory of being wrapped in a soft blanket. Rosa's smile grew wider, her own eyes glistening. "Do you want to see her?" More crying came through the speaker, followed by what sounded like prayers of thanks, the words tumbling over each other in a rush of emotion. Judge Daniels turned to Michaela, his eyes gentle. all traces of his usual sternness gone. "Are you ready to meet her?" Michaela nodded slowly, her small movement carrying the weight of years of loneliness and fear finally lifting. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but for the first time in as long as she could remember, it wasn't from sadness. The courthouse lobby stretched long and quiet, its marble floors reflecting the dim evening light filtering through tall windows. Most of the day's bustle had died down, leaving behind an almost sacred silence. Michaela perched on the edge of a worn wooden bench, her small fingers interlaced so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Her heart thundered in her chest as she waited, each second feeling like an eternity. The heavy glass doors swung open with a soft whoosh. A woman stepped through, her movements hesitant but purposeful. Loretta Robinson carried herself with quiet dignity despite her obvious emotion, her gray-streaked hair pulled back neatly, her warm brown eyes already brimming with tears. She wore a simple floral dress and clutched her purse like an anchor. The moment stretched between them, charged with 8 years of separation. Loretta stopped a few feet away, her trembling hands rising to cover her mouth. Her eyes took in every detail of her granddaughter's face, seeing echoes of her own daughter there. Michaela sat frozen, unsure what to do or say. This woman was family, real family, but she felt like a stranger. Yet something in Loretta's eyes spoke of home, of belonging, of unconditional love that had never stopped searching. Loretta moved closer, her steps careful as if approaching a frightened bird. She lowered herself to her knees, not caring about her dress or the hard floor. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I lost you." Michaela felt something shift inside her chest, a wall beginning to crumble. She slid off the bench, taking one small step forward, then another. Loretta opened her arms, and Michaela found herself moving into them. The embrace was gentle at first, tentative, but then Loretta pulled her close, holding her like she'd never let go again. "You're safe now, baby," she murmured into Michaela's hair, tears flowing freely. "No one will take you from me again." From the side, Judge Daniels watched the reunion, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his shoulders relaxed for the first time that day. Beside him, David Fisher cleared his throat roughly, trying to be subtle as he wiped at his eyes with his sleeve. Rosa McKinney stood a few steps back, a gentle smile playing across her face as she watched years of wrong finally being made right. Her clipboard hung forgotten at her side. The dam inside Michaela finally broke. She buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder and let out 8 years' worth of tears. Tears of relief, of fear, of hope, of finally feeling safe. Loretta just held her tighter, rocking gently, murmuring soft words of comfort and love. Judge Daniels drew in a deep breath, then straightened his shoulders. "Let's get the paperwork started," he said, his voice gentle but firm with purpose. The car glided through the quiet streets, streetlights casting intermittent shadows across Michaela's face as she pressed her forehead against the cool window. Her breath created small patches of fog that faded as quickly as they appeared. Loretta's hand remained steady over hers, warm and reassuring, though Michaela noticed how her grandmother's fingers trembled slightly. The city slowly transformed into a residential neighborhood, where old oak trees lined the streets and modest homes stood close together like old friends. When they pulled up to Loretta's house, Michaela's grip on her seat tightened. The porch light cast a gentle yellow glow, illuminating wind chimes that tinkled softly in the evening breeze. "This is home," Loretta said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You're home now, baby." Michaela stepped out slowly, clutching her worn backpack to her chest. The house wasn't big or fancy like Walter's, but something about it felt different. Safer. The wooden porch steps creaked under their feet as they approached the front door. Inside, the aroma of fresh-baked bread and lavender wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Family photos lined the walls, and a well-loved couch sat beneath a window with hand-crocheted throws draped over its arms. Everything felt lived in, loved. "Let me show you your room," Loretta whispered, leading the way down a short hallway. The bedroom was small but cozy, with pale blue walls and white curtains that rustled in the breeze from a partially open window. A quilted bed dominated one corner, its pattern a symphony of blues and purples. On the dresser, a single framed photograph caught Michaela's eye, a young woman with her same eyes and smile. "That was your mama's room," Loretta explained, her voice soft and careful. "She grew up right here." Michaela stood frozen, her backpack hanging limply from her fingers. She stared at the photo of her mother, unable to form words. Dinner was a quiet affair at the small kitchen table. Steam rose from bowls of homemade soup, and the cornbread smelled like heaven, but Michaela could barely eat. She sat rigid in her chair, taking tiny bites, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Loretta didn't push or scold. She just kept the soup warm and offered gentle smiles. Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Michaela stared at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars had been carefully arranged. The bedside lamp cast a soft glow across the room, chasing away the darkest shadows. Her body felt heavy with exhaustion, but her mind raced with the day's events. A gentle knock preceded Loretta's head peeking around the door. "Do you want me to turn off the light, baby?" Michaela shook her head quickly, her fingers clutching the quilt. The light stayed on, a beacon against old fears that weren't ready to let go just yet. The shadows stretched across the ceiling like dark fingers, and Michaela's eyes snapped open in the darkness. Her heart pounded against her ribs as the remnants of her nightmare clung to her mind. Walter Harrington's cold smile, his calculating eyes, the way he'd lunged forward in the courtroom. It all swirled in her thoughts, making her chest tight with fear. She pulled her knees to her chest, the unfamiliar bed creaking beneath her. The room felt different from the stark, clinical spaces she'd grown used to in foster homes. Here, even in darkness, she could make out the gentle flutter of lace curtains and smell the lingering scent of lavender from the sachet hanging by the window. But fear didn't care about lavender or lace. It gripped her throat, making each breath shorter than the last. The shadows seemed to move, and for a terrifying moment she thought she saw Walter's silhouette on the wall. The door hinges gave a soft whine as they moved, and Michaela froze. But instead of Walter's commanding presence, a gentler figure appeared in the doorway. Loretta stood there in her worn floral robe, her gray hair wrapped in a silk scarf, concern etched across her face. "Baby, you okay?" Her voice was soft, like a warm blanket on a cold night. Michaela's throat felt too tight to speak. Her fingers clutched the quilted bedspread, knuckles white with tension. She wanted to answer, to reach out, but years of learned caution held her back. Loretta stepped into the room, her slippered feet making hushed sounds against the wooden floor. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, like someone approaching a frightened bird. The older woman lowered herself into the chair beside the bed, its ancient wood creaking softly under her weight. "You ain't gotta talk if you don't want to," Loretta said, her voice gentle but firm. "Just know I'm here." Michaela watched her grandmother through the darkness, studying her face. There was something in Loretta's eyes, not pity, not the clinical concern of social workers, but something deeper, something that reminded Michaela of old photographs she'd seen of her mother. After what felt like forever, Michaela managed a small nod. Her breathing began to slow, matching the steady rhythm of Loretta's presence. Instead of pressing for conversation or trying to fix things with empty words, Loretta began to hum. The melody was old and sweet, a gospel tune that seemed to float through the darkness like a prayer. The sound wrapped around Michaela like a protective shield, pushing back against the shadows that had seemed so threatening moments before. Her body began to relax muscle by muscle as the gentle humming continued. Her grip on the bedspread loosened. Her shoulders dropped from their defensive hunch. The nightmare's grip started to fade, replaced by the simple comfort of not being alone. Michaela's eyes grew heavy as Loretta's song continued, the familiar tune carrying her back toward sleep. She didn't speak, didn't reach out, but for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace as she drifted off to the sound of her grandmother's voice. The morning sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across Michaela's bed. Her eyes fluttered open, and for one terrifying moment, panic seized her chest. The unfamiliar room made her breath catch, until the memories of yesterday slowly trickled back. The courtroom, Judge Daniels, Walter in handcuffs, and Loretta, her grandmother. The bed was softer than any she'd slept in before. The quilt smelled like fresh laundry and something sweet she couldn't name. On the dresser, her mother's picture watched over her, young and smiling, frozen in time. Downstairs, pots and pans clinked together in a gentle rhythm. The aroma of bacon wafted up, making her stomach growl. Michaela padded down the stairs, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden steps. She paused at the kitchen doorway, watching. Loretta moved with easy grace around the kitchen, humming an old hymn as she flipped bacon and pulled golden biscuits from the oven. Her gray hair was tied back with a colorful scarf, and her hands seemed to know exactly where everything belonged. This was a dance she'd done countless times before. Michaela slid into a chair at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the scratched wood surface. She didn't know what to say. What did granddaughters say to grandmothers they'd just met? The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but uncertain. A sharp knock at the door shattered the morning peace. Michaela's body went rigid, her fingers curling into fists. In her experience, knocks meant social workers coming to take her away. They meant new homes, new rules, new ways to be hurt. Loretta wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. Rosa McKinney stood there, her kind face familiar from yesterday, a manila folder tucked under her arm. "Good morning," she said softly. "Just checking in." Michaela's knuckles went white as she gripped the edge of her chair. Her throat felt tight. This was how it always started. A friendly visit, a quiet conversation, then packed bags and another car ride to somewhere worse. Rosa must have seen the fear in her eyes because she quickly added, "No one's taking you anywhere, sweetheart. I just want to see how you're settling in." Loretta moved closer to Michaela, not touching her, but close enough to be a steady presence. The bacon sizzled in the pan, filling the kitchen with its homey smell. Outside, birds chirped in the morning sun. Michaela looked between Rosa and Loretta, then down at her hands. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to trust that this time would be different, that this home would last, that she wouldn't have to leave again. She gave a small nod, not quite believing it yet, but allowing herself to hope. Just a little. The old photo album creaked as Loretta pulled it from the shelf, decades of dust dancing in the morning light. She settled onto the worn couch, patting the space beside her. Michaela hesitated for a moment before sitting down, keeping a careful distance between them. "Look here," Loretta said softly, opening to the first page. The plastic sleeve crackled as she pointed to a faded photograph. "That's your mama when she was just about your age." Michaela leaned in slightly, her eyes fixed on the image. A young girl with bright eyes and braided hair smiled at the camera, standing proud in front of this very house. She wore a yellow dress with a white collar, her hands clasped behind her back. She loved yellow, Loretta explained, her voice warm with memory. Said it was like wearing sunshine. Michaela's finger traced the outline of her mother's face. Something tight and painful squeezed in her chest. The girl in the photo looked so happy, so safe. "She was strong," Loretta said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you got that same fire in you." Michaela ducked her head, unconvinced. She didn't feel strong. Strong people didn't wake up scared of shadows. Strong people didn't flinch at loud noises. As Loretta turned another page, something slipped from between the sheets. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, fluttered to the floor. Michaela picked it up, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes widened as she read the letterhead, Child Protective Services. The letter was dated 3 years ago. Loretta's handwriting filled the page, desperate and pleading. "I am writing to request custody of my granddaughter, Michaela Robinson." The words blurred as Michaela kept reading. "She belongs with family. I can provide a loving home." Her hands began to shake. All this time she thought no one wanted her, that no one was looking for her. But here was proof, written in ink and tears, that someone had been fighting for her all along. "I never stopped looking for you," Loretta whispered, her eyes glistening. "Not for one single day." Tears burned behind Michaela's eyes. She blinked hard, trying to hold them back. Years of foster homes had taught her that crying was weakness, that tears meant punishment. The letter trembled in her hands. She wanted to say something, anything, but words felt impossible. How do you thank someone for never giving up on you? How do you express the relief of finally being found? Loretta reached out slowly, offering her hand palm up on the photo album. An invitation, not a demand. Michaela stared at it for a long moment. Then carefully, she placed her small hand in her grandmother's. They sat there in silence, connected by touch and truth, while morning light streamed through the windows and the old house creaked its welcome. Judge Daniels sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by towers of case files that detailed Walter Harrington's web of corruption. His fingers traced the edges of yet another damning document, bank statements showing suspicious transfers to former social workers who had mysteriously disappeared. The morning light filtered through his office windows, casting long shadows across the cluttered surface. Every piece of paper told the same story: children vanishing, records being erased, people being silenced. The evidence was overwhelming, yet Harrington's legal team was already mounting their defense. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. David Fisher entered, his young face etched with worry lines that hadn't been there a week ago. His tie was slightly crooked, and he clutched a legal brief in his trembling hands. "They're pushing for an appeal," Fisher said, his voice tight, "claiming you locked down the courtroom unlawfully." Judge Daniels didn't even look up from his files. "I locked it down to stop an injustice. I'd do it again." His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Fisher dropped into one of the chairs across from the desk, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They're going after you now, Judge, saying you let emotions cloud your judgment." That made Daniels pause. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. He'd known this was coming. Walter Harrington had hired 3 of the most aggressive defense attorneys in the state. The morning papers were already questioning his decision to lock down the courtroom, painting him as an activist judge overstepping his bounds. The media circus was growing. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, hungry for any detail about the wealthy businessman accused of exploiting foster children. Harrington's team was spinning the narrative, trying to make it about judicial overreach rather than missing children. Fisher shuffled through his papers nervously. "Michaela's still set to testify, but..." He swallowed hard. "I'm worried about the pressure on her. These defense attorneys, they're sharks." Daniels's eyes drifted to a silver-framed photograph on his desk. His daughter smiled back at him, cap and gown from her law school graduation. She'd been Michaela's age once, just as vulnerable. The thought of her in Michaela's situation made his blood run cold. "I won't let them intimidate her," he said firmly, "and I won't let Harrington walk free. Not this time." His words hung in the air, heavy with determination. The system had failed these children before, but it wouldn't happen again. Not in his courtroom, not on his watch. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden table where Michaela sat, her shoulders hunched. The stack of golden pancakes in front of her remained untouched, steam rising in delicate wisps. Loretta watched her granddaughter with concern etched across her face, her hands clasped together. "Baby, you gotta eat," Loretta said softly, her voice carrying years of maternal warmth. "They're your mama's recipe." Michaela's fork scraped against the ceramic plate, pushing the pancakes around aimlessly. "Not hungry," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background when Rosa McKinney arrived, her sensible shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. She carried her usual folder, but her smile was gentle, understanding. She settled into a chair at the table, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle Michaela. "I've been thinking," Rosa began carefully. "Maybe it's time to consider getting back to school. There's a nice one just down the street." Michaela's body went rigid. Her fork clattered against the plate as her fingers tightened around it. "I don't want to," she said firmly, her voice carrying an edge of panic. Loretta leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern. "Why not, baby?" she asked, reaching out but stopping short of touching Michaela's arm, always mindful of giving her space. Michaela's gaze remained fixed on her plate, her shoulders drawing up even tighter. The silence in the kitchen grew heavy with unspoken fears. Her experiences had taught her harsh lessons about trust, about teachers who didn't ask questions when she came to class with bruises, about kids who learned to look the other way, about a system that had failed her repeatedly. Rosa and Loretta exchanged knowing looks across the table. They understood the weight of Michaela's silence, the trauma that lay beneath her refusal. Neither woman moved to pressure her further. "We'll take our time," Loretta finally said, her voice steady and reassuring. She reached out slowly, placing her weathered hand over Michaela's small one. "For now, we focus on making you feel safe." The pancakes continued to cool on the plate, untouched, but no one mentioned them again. Some battles weren't worth fighting today. Safety and trust had to come first. The courthouse corridors echoed with footsteps as Michaela walked beside Loretta, her small hand gripping her grandmother's tightly. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, making everything feel too bright, too exposed. Michaela's heart hammered in her chest with each step. "It's okay, baby," Loretta whispered, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Judge Daniels just wants to talk." They reached his chambers where Bailiff Johnson stood guard. He offered Michaela a kind smile and opened the heavy wooden door. The judge's office was warmer than she expected, with afternoon sunlight filtering through tall windows. Judge Daniels sat behind his desk, his usual stern expression softened. When he saw Michaela, something rare happened. He smiled. It transformed his whole face, making him look younger, gentler. "Hello, Michaela," he said, his deep voice quiet. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, unable to find her voice. Loretta guided her to a chair, keeping close. "Do you know how brave you are?" Judge Daniels asked, leaning forward slightly. Michaela stared at her shoes, shrugging her thin shoulders. "I don't feel brave," she whispered. The judge reached for a paper on his desk, his movements careful, measured. "I want to show you something," he said, holding it out to her. Michaela took it with trembling fingers. It was a list of names, kids who had been in foster care before her. Some names made her breath catch. She recognized them from whispered conversations in Harrington's house. Others were completely unfamiliar, but beside them were stark words like missing or whereabouts unknown. "These are the children the system failed," Judge Daniels explained, his voice heavy with regret. "Kids whose voices weren't heard. Kids like you, who needed someone to listen." Michaela's fingers tightened on the paper, making it crinkle slightly. Each name represented a story, a life, a child who had been ignored or forgotten. She thought about Jordan Matthews, whose name was near the top of the list. "Your testimony," Judge Daniels continued, "could change everything, not just for you, but for every child who comes after you, every child who needs protection." The weight of his words settled over her. This wasn't just about escaping Harrington anymore. It was about all of them. The ones who got away, the ones who disappeared, the ones who might still be saved. Her hands shook as she gripped the paper, but when she lifted her head to meet Judge Daniels's gaze, there was determination in her eyes. "I'll testify," she said, her voice small but steady. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Loretta's front porch as Michaela sat on the weathered wooden steps. Her fingers traced the rough grain of the wood, a habit she'd developed over the past few days when her thoughts got too heavy. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine from Loretta's garden. Down on the sidewalk, neighborhood kids played without a care in the world. Their laughter floated up to the porch, a sound that used to make Michaela's chest tight with longing. A little girl in pink shorts pedaled her bicycle back and forth, her pigtails bouncing with each push of the pedals. The bike's training wheels clicked against the concrete in a steady rhythm. The girl made another pass, then slowed to a stop. She looked up at Michaela with curious eyes and raised her hand in a friendly wave. Michaela's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to look away, to shrink back into herself like she'd done so many times before. But something felt different today. Maybe it was the safety of Loretta's presence behind her in the doorway. Maybe it was knowing that Walter Harrington couldn't hurt her anymore. Whatever it was, Michaela found her own hand lifting slowly, tentatively returning the wave. The simple gesture felt foreign, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. But it also felt possible. The little girl beamed, showing off a gap-toothed smile before pedaling away. From the doorway, Loretta watched silently, her heart swelling with pride and hope. She didn't rush forward or make a big deal of the moment. She just stood there, a gentle guardian, letting Michaela find her own way. Michaela's shoulders relaxed slightly as she watched the kids play. The knot in her stomach that had been there for years wasn't gone, but it felt looser somehow. She didn't feel normal. Not yet. But for the first time, she could imagine what normal might feel like. The evening breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sounds of life. Real life, not just survival. Michaela took a deep breath, then slowly let it out. With each exhale, she felt a tiny piece of her past float away, like autumn leaves carried on the wind. The kitchen was filled with warm afternoon sunlight as Loretta stood at the counter, her strong hands working the cookie dough with practiced ease. Her flowered apron was already dusted with flour, and the whole house smelled like vanilla and butter. Michaela sat at the kitchen table watching intently as her grandmother's fingers pressed and rolled the soft dough. "You want to help?" Loretta asked, glancing over her shoulder with a raised eyebrow and gentle smile. Michaela shifted in her chair, uncertainty written across her face. At Walter's house, the kitchen had been off limits. She'd learned early on not to ask for treats or show interest in cooking. The memory made her hands clench in her lap. Loretta must have sensed her hesitation because she wiped her hands on her apron and held out the rolling pin. "Come on now, baby. These cookies ain't gonna roll themselves." Slowly, Michaela slid off her chair and approached the counter. Loretta pulled over a stepping stool so she could reach better, then stood behind her, placing the wooden rolling pin in her small hands. "Just like this," Loretta guided, her warm hands covering Michaela's. Together they pressed the pin into the dough, rolling it out in smooth strokes. A cloud of flour puffed up suddenly, coating Loretta's apron in white powder. Michaela froze, her breath catching. But then something unexpected happened. A small giggle escaped her lips. The sound surprised her as much as anyone. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed. At Walter's, laughter had been dangerous, drawing unwanted attention. Loretta put her hands on her hips, trying to look stern but failing miserably. "Oh, you think that's funny, do you?" She fought to keep a straight face, but her eyes twinkled with mischief. Something inside Michaela broke free. The giggles turned into real laughter, bright and clear as a bell. Loretta joined in, her deep, warm chuckle filling the kitchen. They worked side by side, cutting out shapes with cookie cutters, stars, hearts, and little flowers. Loretta showed her how to space them properly on the baking sheet, explaining that cookies need room to grow. When some of the shapes came out wonky, Loretta just smiled and said they had character. The kitchen timer dinged, and Loretta pulled out the first batch. Golden brown cookies filled the air with their sweet aroma. Michaela watched as Loretta transferred them carefully to a cooling rack. "Here you go, baby," Loretta said, offering her a warm cookie. "Careful now, it's still hot." Michaela took a small bite, letting the sweetness melt on her tongue. It wasn't just a cookie. It was something more. Something that felt like belonging, like safety, like home. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Walter Harrington was led inside, his expensive suit wrinkled from his time in custody, his wrists bound by cold metal handcuffs. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters scribbling in notepads, social workers clutching files, and curious onlookers drawn by the headlines of corruption and missing children. Michaela sat between David Fisher and Loretta, her small hand gripping her grandmother's weathered fingers. She wore a simple blue dress Loretta had bought her hair neatly braided. The outfit made her look her age, just a little girl who'd seen too much. Judge Daniels strode in, his black robes flowing behind him. The room fell silent as he took his seat, his face stern and determined. The bang of his gavel echoed through the hushed courtroom. Court is now in session. Walter's face remained a mask of indifference, but his eyes darted toward Michaela. Those eyes had once made her tremble, had once held power over her every moment. But today was different. Today, she met his gaze steadily. Her chin lifted slightly. She didn't look away. She didn't shrink. For the first time, she saw him for what he was, just a man. A cruel man, but nothing more. The prosecution team began their presentation, methodically laying out their evidence. Financial records showed suspicious patterns of large withdrawals. Missing case files revealed systematic cover-ups. Then came the survivor testimonies, other foster children who'd managed to escape Walter's home, their stories eerily similar to Michaela's. David Fisher leaned over, his voice gentle but firm. "It's time." Loretta squeezed her hand one last time, whispering, "You got this, baby." Michaela stood, smoothing her dress with trembling fingers. The walk to the witness stand felt like miles, each step echoing in her ears. Bailiff Johnson helped her up onto the raised platform, his kind eyes offering silent encouragement. She placed her small hand on the Bible, its leather cover cool beneath her palm. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God." "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. She settled into the chair, meeting Judge Daniels's steady gaze. He nodded slightly, a gesture of support that made her shoulders straighten. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all she had to say. Then she began to speak. Her voice came out strong and clear, surprising even herself. "The first night at Mr. Harrington's house, I knew something was wrong." The courthouse hallway stretched endlessly, its marble floors reflecting the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Michaela sat on a wooden bench beside Loretta, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart beating so fast she thought it might burst. The waiting felt like torture. David Fisher paced back and forth, his shoes clicking against the floor, occasionally checking his watch or running his fingers through his disheveled hair. The young lawyer had grown more confident since that first day in court, but now his nerves were showing again. Loretta hummed softly, an old gospel tune that seemed to keep Michaela anchored. Her grandmother's presence was steady, unwavering, like a lighthouse in a storm. Every few minutes she would pat Michaela's hand, a gentle reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. The heavy wooden doors suddenly creaked open. A bailiff emerged, his face serious. "The jury's back." Everyone filed into the courtroom, the air thick with tension. Michaela slipped into her seat, Loretta right beside her. Walter Harrington sat at the defense table, his expensive suit still crisp, his posture rigid with practiced confidence. Judge Daniels entered, taking his place at the bench. His eyes swept across the courtroom before landing on the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, a piece of paper clutched in slightly trembling hands. "Yes, Your Honor." The room held its breath. Michaela felt Loretta's hand tighten around hers. David Fisher straightened his tie, standing a little taller. "On the charges of child endangerment, abuse, and obstruction of justice," the foreman's voice rang clear and strong, "we find the defendant guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery started crying. Walter Harrington's shoulders stiffened, his jaw locking into place as his carefully constructed world crumbled around him. Judge Daniels nodded, his face stern. "Mr. Harrington, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no chance of parole." The words fell like hammer blows in the silent courtroom. Walter's mask finally cracked, a flicker of fear crossing his face as reality set in. Michaela exhaled deeply, a breath she felt like she'd been holding forever. She watched as the bailiffs approached Walter, as the handcuffs clicked into place, as the man who had terrorized so many children was finally led away. The monster was gone. The courthouse hadn't changed in a year, but Michaela had. Her steps were confident as she walked through the marble hallway, her hand tucked safely in Loretta's. Her new yellow dress swished around her knees, and her hair, now longer and styled in neat braids, bounced with each step. The fear that once haunted her eyes had been replaced by something brighter. Hope. Loretta beamed with pride beside her, wearing her Sunday best. The past year had transformed them both. Their house was now truly a home, filled with laughter, the smell of fresh-baked cookies, and countless small victories. Michaela had finally started school again, making friends and even joining the choir. As they rounded the corner, they spotted Judge Daniels standing near his chambers reviewing a file. He looked up at their approach, and something rare happened. His stern expression softened into a smile. "You look good, Miss Robinson," he said, his voice warm. Michaela's face lit up with a genuine grin. "I feel good, Your Honor." David Fisher appeared then, looking more polished than he had a year ago. The case had changed him too, giving him confidence and purpose. He extended his hand to Judge Daniels. "Thank you again," Fisher said earnestly, shaking the judge's hand, "for standing up for Michaela when nobody else would." Michaela reached into her small purse and pulled out an envelope. The paper was slightly crumpled, and her handwriting was careful, but still childlike. She held it out to Judge Daniels. "It's a thank you," she said softly, her voice steady and clear, "for saving me." Judge Daniels accepted the letter with a solemn nod, clearly touched by the gesture. He tucked it carefully into his pocket, treating it like something precious. When they stepped outside, the summer sun warmed Michaela's face. She looked up at the blue sky, feeling the breeze on her skin. The world stretched out before her, full of possibilities. For the first time in her life, she was truly free. If you enjoyed the story of Daniels, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.